Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into a massive global energy shock that's literally splitting the world economy in two right now. We're talking about two totally different realities unfolding in Europe and Africa. So if you're trying to figure out where inflation is going, why interest rates seem glued to the ceiling, or where the actual growth is hiding, stick around because you're in exactly the right place.
Let's take a quick look at our agenda for today. We've got 6 parts. First, the global inflation resurgence. Second, Europe's stagflation risk. Third, central banks fight back. Fourth, Africa's economic resilience. Fifth, mobilizing capital for Africa. And finally, the consumer wild card. Let's get right into it.
Okay, Section 1. The global inflation resurgence.
You know, at the start of the year, almost everyone thought inflation was finally chilling out. We all thought it would just stay stable. But man, that narrative flipped completely upside down in just a few short months. Now, the absolute biggest question on every financial radar is this: are rate hikes actually back on the horizon?
Well, what we're looking at is essentially a massive chain reaction. It starts with geopolitical conflict. Specifically, the tensions keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed off. That is a massive choke point, and it's severely disrupting global energy flows. Because of that, S&P Global is now projecting that Brent crude oil could average $110 a barrel for the rest of 2026. And that price spike, it's the first domino to fall. It drives up inflation all over the world, which then backs central banks into a corner, pressuring them to raise interest rates all over again just to cool things off.
Listen to this warning from Bruce Kasman, the chief global economist over at JP Morgan. He says the energy price spike is now raising inflation and generating a sharp squeeze on household purchasing power. And that hits the nail right on the head, doesn't it? Surging energy prices basically act like a universal tax on everything we buy. It directly squeezes your wallet. I mean, think about it. If it costs more to put diesel in a delivery truck, it costs more to get groceries to the store. Before you know it, you and I are feeling the pinch on everyday basics.
Moving on to Section 2, Europe's stagflation risk.
So here's the really crucial part. Right now, Europe is staring down the barrel of textbook stagflation. And if you follow economics, you know this is literally a policymaker's worst nightmare. You've got the surging cost of imported energy driving prices up, so there's your inflation, but at the exact same time, it's totally paralyzing domestic economic growth, which is the stagnation part. It's this toxic dual threat that is just incredibly difficult to dig out of.
To really get how severe Europe's position is, we have to contrast it with the US. The US is largely insulated from this because it's actually a net energy exporter, producing its own shale oil and gas. But Europe? Europe has to import roughly 2/3 of its energy. So when oil prices skyrocket, capital just drains right out of the continent to pay for that energy. It makes the entire region uniquely, structurally vulnerable to exactly this kind of shock.
And you can see how this plays out in S&P Global's projections for the Eurozone's 2026 GDP. They lay out 3 scenarios depending on how long these energy delays last. In their baseline scenario, Europe is just barely limping along, with 0.5% of growth. If energy prices fall, sure, they get a mild bump. But look at that severe scenario. If the Strait of Hormuz stays closed and oil spikes even further, major players like Germany, France, and Italy could slide straight into a technical recession by the end of 2026.
That brings us to Section 3, central banks fight back.
Now, what's genuinely alarming here is that this inflation isn't just about the price of oil anymore. It's mutating. JP Morgan is warning that a mix of goods sector cost pressures and tightening labor markets could push core inflation well above 3%. Basically, higher transportation and surging fertilizer costs are bleeding into absolutely everything. We're talking postal services, unprocessed food at the grocery store. These indirect effects are driving core inflation up across the board.
So central banks are forced to fight back. All those rate cuts the markets were hoping for earlier this year, they're largely being abandoned. Instead, we're seeing a new round of tightening globally. The ECB and the Bank of Japan are now expected to hike rates in June and the Bank of England in September. And the Fed, they're postponing cuts all the way to 2027. Even emerging markets are rapidly shifting to a hawkish, defensive stance just to protect their currencies.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Africa's economic resilience.
As we transition away from the developed markets and look at the global south, we find a totally different and, honestly, pretty inspiring economic reality. While Europe is stagnating under heavy energy costs and tight monetary policy, the African Development Bank's outlook shows a continent with remarkable resilience. I mean, despite a totally fragmented world, high trade tensions, and dropping international aid, African economies are actually actively expanding.
Just look at this striking comparison. You've got the Eurozone's baseline 2026 projection at a meager 0.5% growth. Then you have Africa averaging a projected 4.4% growth for 2025. That kind of robust performance firmly places Africa right up there among the world's fastest-growing regions. It showcases a true underlying economic dynamism that is completely bucking the trend of the broader global slowdown. Which leads us to Section 5, Mobilizing Capital for Africa.
But we do need to look under the hood here because that impressive growth hides a massive structural problem. $1.3 trillion. That is a staggering number. To put into perspective, that's roughly the entire GDP of the Netherlands, and it represents Africa's estimated annual development financing gap. See, 4.4% growth is great, but to achieve large-scale poverty reduction, the continent really needs to hit 7% annual growth, sustained over time. To bridge that gap, they desperately need an enormous injection of capital.
The good news? That capital might actually be hiding in plain sight. The African Development Bank points out that a ton of resources are currently untapped right there on the continent. By just improving tax compliance and administration, they could capture around $469 billion in uncollected taxes. And if they can stop the inefficiencies that currently eat up about 40% of public investment, that's another $299 billion freed up every single year. It's wild to think about how much growth could be unlocked just from within.
Of course, getting there requires some serious heavy lifting. Right now, shallow and fragmented financial markets make it really hard to invest domestic savings effectively. Plus, inequality remains stubbornly high, and the region is still highly vulnerable to external shocks. So fixing these deep structural bottlenecks, like finally building integrated Pan-African payment systems, is absolutely crucial. It's really the only way Africa can shield its growth from the turbulent global environment we've been talking about.
All right, our last stop today is Section 6, the Consumer Wildcard.
This is the final piece of our global puzzle, and it ties everything together. Despite those rate hikes, the projections of $110 oil, and all this sticky inflation, consumers, especially in the U.S., have stubbornly kept spending. It's like credit limits don't even exist. U.S. retail sales actually rose 0.5%, and real consumer spending increased, helped out a bit by a cushion of tax refunds. Honestly, the everyday consumer has been the bedrock keeping us from a much deeper global contraction. But the million-dollar question is, how long can this last? With energy bills spiking and central banks tightening their grip on credit, will the consumer finally crack? That is the ultimate wild card right there. If consumer spending plummets, this whole global economic picture could shatter. But if it holds, we might just grind through a really slow adjustment. So looking at the full board, from Europe's stagflation risk to Africa's incredible resilience and capital needs, what do you think is going to happen next? Let that sink in. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. And as always, keep questioning the data.